So if we go back to Erikson's theory, this is the stage of intimacy versus isolation. So the critical psychological conflict during this time is about making a permanent commitment to an intimate partner. Now, this is a conflict because if you think about this stage of development, young adults have just come from adolescence, right? You've just come from rebelling and arguing with your parents to establish some independence from them. And then here you're faced with this critical challenge of commitment. And commitment requires you to give up some of that independence and to do a little bit in terms of re-identifying your identity in terms of two people, right? The values and the interests of two people versus just you as an individual. And this can be especially difficult for the young adults who did not come out of the last stage successfully. So what was the last stage in Erikson's theory? Identity achievement, right, versus role confusion. So if the young adult has not yet developed a sense of independence and identity, then the risk is that the individual will define themselves in terms of their partner rather than bringing their own identity and their own sense of independence to that relationship. And you may have known people like this, right? So it's someone who dates one person and they kind of take on all of the interests and values of that person that they're dating, and then they break up and they start dating someone new, and all of a sudden all of their values and interests change, right, to match with the new person. Now, without intimacy, the risk is loneliness, remaining self-absorbed. Okay, now if you have developed some sense of intimacy in early adulthood according to Erikson, then you also tend to be more cooperative, you tend to enjoy being with others, but you also feel comfortable when alone. So it's really a balance between developing this commitment in a relationship with somebody else, but also feeling comfortable enough with who you are and independent enough to be alone. Now, the sense of isolation comes from maybe a hesitance to form close ties with someone. Maybe the individual feels like they don't want to lose the identity that they have. Maybe they tend to be more competitive versus cooperative. Maybe they feel threatened if somebody gets too close. So these are just some of the things that can go into that stage in Erikson's theory. Now, the trouble always with Erikson's theory is that it's so black and white, right? That it's sort of all or nothing. And so other theories have expanded and modified upon Erikson's approach by adding a little bit more flexibility to this stage. So Levinson, in his theory and research, came up with this notion of seasons of life. And what Levinson did is he conducted extensive biographical interviews with participants that were already between the ages of 35 to 45. So women and men were included. So what's interesting is, the sample was a bit older. A lot of the interviews were retrospective in nature, so people had to kind of remember what things were like as they went through this stage of early adulthood. So you can kind of put that in the back of your mind, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. But what he found in his research is that there was a common path of change of individuals in early adulthood. There were slightly different patterns for men and women, which we'll talk about. Okay, but what he thought of was that development really did occur as a sequence during this time, and that you have these qualitatively distinct eras or stages or seasons. And each of those seasons of life has its own challenges. Okay, so each era, each season begins with a transition that lasts for about 5 years. So you see on the slide that you have an early adulthood transition that goes from 17 to 22 years, and then you enter that season or life structure for early adulthood, which is between 22 to 28 years. And then you go through another transition at age 30, and then enter another season or life structure from 33 to 40 years. Okay, so between the transitions, people are moving into these seasons of life or these eras in which they concentrate on building a life structure, right? So they're striving for, in general, in a very broad way, some balance between their interpersonal demands and their outer social demands. And so the life structure is just a pattern of how the person's life at any given time is made up with their relationships with significant others and also the responsibilities they have. So let's say family relationships and perhaps occupation as well. Levinson also found that during the early adulthood transition, most of his participants constructed what he called a dream. And the dream is just an image of the self in the adult world that helps to guide decision making. And the more specific the dream was, the more purposeful the individual's behavior was in terms of building that season or that life structure, that era. Now, men and women had slightly different types of dreams. Men's dreams were more of sort of the independent achiever in an occupational role, so their dreams tended to be more individualistic. And when they included others as a part of their dream, let's say significant others, they really viewed those significant others as supporters of their own individualistic goals. For women, he saw a little bit more of a mixture. There was a small number, a minority of women, that did have a career dream that dominated, so similar to men. But most of the women in his sample displayed what he called split dreams. So, what would a split dream be? What would that include? What Levinson found is that the split dream is where both marriage and family and career are prominent, right? So women really want both of those things. Women also had less individualistic goals than men did. They tended to define themselves in terms of their relationships. So to define themselves as the wife of or the mother of, right? So defining themselves in terms of those relationships versus only seeing significant others as possible supporters of their own individualistic goals. In the early adulthood transition, young adults also, typically in Levinson's sample, tended to form a relationship with a mentor. And the mentor is someone who helps you to realize your dream. And it can be anyone, really. It can be someone that's older, that's more experienced in whatever world it is that you wish to enter as an adult, whether it's someone experienced in the occupation you're interested in, someone that's experienced in terms of marriage and family, right? So it could be a senior colleague at work, it could be a friend, a neighbor, a relative. And typically the mentor acted as some kind of teacher or sponsor that really helped the individual to reach their goals, to reach their dreams. What Levinson also found was that it tended to be easier for men to find a supportive mentor than women, because men were really working towards this one goal of occupation, and those kinds of mentors are readily available. For women who had those split dreams, it was a bit more difficult for them to find mentors. Now, during the age 30 transition, what the individual is doing is they're reevaluating their life structure, reevaluating the season that they've just been in. And if necessary, they try to change aspects of the life structure that they see as being inadequate. So let's say the individual initially in their first era was really preoccupied with career, and they get to the age 30 transition and they're still single. Well, perhaps that individual will feel dissatisfied with that and become concerned with finding a life partner. And what Levinson found is that women who tended to stress marriage and motherhood early on tended to, at this point, develop more individualistic goals. So they tended to become, for example, more conscious perhaps of aspects of their marriage that were kind of holding them back from developing further, from developing that independent side of their dream. And so what Levinson found in his women was that these women tended to demand that their husbands recognize their interests and aspirations beyond the home, support them in pursuing some of those interests. Now, if men and women were not satisfied with either their relationship or their occupational accomplishments, then that age 30 transition could sometimes become what we would call a crisis. But we'll definitely talk more about midlife crisis in middle adulthood and discuss whether that actually happens with any regularity. Now, that life structure or era or season between the ages of 33 to 40 is described as, at least for men, a period of settling down. Men at this time tend to focus on very specific relationships and focus in on specific goals and aspirations, and they start to make other relationships and other goals and aspirations more secondary or even set them aside altogether. So, what men are doing during this time is they really are trying to establish a stable niche in society. They tend to anchor themselves much more firmly in family, in occupation, and perhaps even in their community. For women, though, you don't really see this period as a period of settling down. Okay? Many women during this time remain a bit unsettled, probably because they perhaps had been focusing on one aspect of their dream and now add on the additional aspect. So if they were focusing on family, they now start to focus on occupation, right? And that has to then be reintegrated into their life structure, and that takes a bit more work. So it's really not until about middle adulthood that many women start to show the kind of stability that is typical of men in their 30s. Now, Valiant also collected some data. Valiant followed actually 94 men and started interviewing these men in college and then followed them for 30 years. So he gave them very extensive interviews in college, and then each decade after college, he sent out lengthy questionnaires about the participants' current lives. Okay, and what he found was this pattern of changes, and it's interesting because I think it sort of maps on pretty well to what Erickson would say in his theory is happening. So, in the 20s, his participants tended to be devoted to intimacy concerns, right, having that committed relationship. In the 30s, they tended to focus more on career consolidation, really getting established in their occupation. And by the 40s, moving away from focusing only on individual achievement and more toward giving to others and guiding others. And if you look at this last bullet point, the 40s, this is really similar to Erickson's next stage, which involves generativity and a strong sense of wanting to give back to the next generation. And so this seems to be pretty similar. Now, the problem with both of these theories is the following. One of the things about both of these samples is that they were collected based on people that were born in the 1920s and 40s. So these are not very recent samples. There's quite a cohort difference there between then and now. And so the concern is, the question is whether the findings that they got and the patterns that they saw in their samples would apply to a newer sample of modern young people. For instance, I would wonder if male participants now, currently in their 20s, would show as much concern with intimacy as was found in the earlier data. So we just need to update the data sets. Also, the interviews in both studies were based on college-educated samples. So these are not necessarily representative samples, and the patterns might look different across an educated versus a not educated sample. So we would need to strive for not only a more current sample, but a more representative sample. And then remember that Levinson's sample was interviewed after some of those critical years in early adulthood. The participants were already aged 35 to 45, and so they had to do some remembering of what things were like in earlier adulthood, and that may not be the best way to approach some of this data collection. Now, one thing that we begin to do in early adulthood is to look to the social clock to evaluate how we're doing. So, in childhood and adolescence, what we tended to do was we tended to use social comparisons. We tended to look at ourselves next to our peers and say, how am I doing next to the people that I'm in a group with on a day to day basis? And what we do in adulthood is we actually compare ourselves based on our age, right? So, how am I doing based on people my age? And that ties into the social clock. And these are just age graded expectations for life events. So, think for a minute, what are some of the life events that we are expected to begin in early adulthood? That can include beginning your first job, right? Getting married, perhaps the birth of your first child, buying a home, etc. And if you feel like you're behind, then you might experience some psychological distress with regard to that. And it may not even be that you necessarily feel behind, but that the rest of society kind of points out to you all the time that you're behind. So when are you going to get married? When are you going to have children? Etc.